Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to be back down here in Wilmington. What a day. I was speaking to the ladies book club there in Morehead City today at lunch. They're on Atlantic Beach at the Dune Club. Great. Not complaining about this, but wow. Sitting there talking about a book and looking at the ocean. Busy time for me here tonight. Tomorrow I'm right back home in Beaufort. I got 2 tours at Fort Macon. I load up at Bentonville, got a little work there. And then Saturday I'm at Salisbury talking to the prison about the prison hospital, General Hospital number 9. Which is a very tragic humanitarian story. But anyways, it's good to be here. I'm talking tonight specifically on volume 2 of my book, but I'm going to start off with a little bit about volume 1 as we get going. Just in case some of you may not have heard my first talk on the hospitals, it's important that we understand what we know today as a hospital, or even as a registered nurse. And that concept did not exist right before the Civil War. The closest thing to a registered nurse in America was the Sisters of Charity, the Catholic nun, but they were not there for folks just with a common cold. Those were the folks that were down in the street, literally, no life around them. And when we look at the hospitals as well, here in North Carolina, there's only 3. Have nothing to do with the general population. 2 of them are run by the federal government. They're your merchant mariner hospitals. Those, if you fall out of the rigging of a ship, you break both legs. You know, you can't swing in a hammock for 2.5 weeks going across the Atlantic going back to Europe. So you're put up here in the hospital, either at Portsmouth Island, right off Ocracoke, or one down here in Wilmington. The other hospital, founded by a lady by the name of Dorothea Dix, was a state mental institution. So the question is, what do you do if you were a Confederate soldier in the South? Where did you get your health care from? The women of the family. The women were the primary caregivers in the family. If mom and sister couldn't figure it out, and if grandmama couldn't figure it out, then you called in the local doctor, the country doctor. So understand, going into this war, if you're a Confederate soldier, what's a hospital and what's a nurse? And oh, by the way, the Confederate Army just copied the playbook from the U.S. Army, which was essentially, you 2 soldiers are detailed to be nurses. Okay, we'll see how good that goes. Right? So in Southern society, women were the primary health care givers. And what's important to understand amongst these women, you have some of the wealthiest ones in the state, or like Barbara Franks over here, who's a single mom from Asheville. Her husband left her. She's trying to raise a family. She makes $35 a month as a head matron in the Asheville hospital. So there's money to be made there as well as this young lady here from Morehead City. She's up there with Rose Greenhouse. She's one of North Carolina's notorious Confederate spies, but early in the war, yes. What's different in the North than it was here? North, as in
New York and Massachusetts, do they have hospitals?
I haven't studied the northern piece.
Okay,
yeah. So when you look at Emmeline Pickett, early in the war, she's a volunteer nurse in the hospital down in Morehead City before she takes on her espionage exploits. And all these ladies wanted to be like this one right here, whether you're north or south. Very popular reading amongst women from both north and south was Florence Nightingale. Her notes on nursing and her notes on hospitals. Very important reading. The one thing I learned, you got to follow the money. I thought every hospital is a Confederate Army hospital, right? Or a U.S. Army hospital. No, not these down here in the Confederacy. You've got to follow the money. Early on in the war, both sides went into this thing thinking it was going to be over in 30 or 60 days. So neither Confederate Congress or our United States Congress allocated money for hospitals. But we know the war went on for more than 69 days. But initially, when you're bringing all these boys from the farms in rural North Carolina and you're putting them in a training camp over at Camp Wyatt or up in Raleigh or Charlotte or Greensboro, you bring all these boys in. There's no such thing as childhood vaccinations back then. So things like measles and mumps creeps in. And then although because they don't have very good hygiene, some nasty stuff like typhus and typhoid starts to come in there. And then you always have the threat of chickenpox and those kind of things that can run rampant. So really early on, both sides, U.S. Army and Confederate Army, was losing more soldiers to disease and non-battle injuries than bullets. Up in Richmond alone, there's over 50 hospitals that were established. Some of these hospitals were privately operated, privately run, 100% by women. You had women jumping on the train here at Wilmington, Raleigh, Charlotte, heading north to Virginia, wherever their brothers and family members were, and were literally running hospitals. Here in North Carolina, the Raleigh legislature appropriated money to establish hospitals in Virginia just solely for Tar Heels. Now, eventually, the Confederate Medical Department will get its act together, and as the war goes on, specifically in Volume 2, you see less of number 1 and number 2, and just about everything is run by the Confederate Medical Department. But it's in these privately run hospitals that the women will get their foot in the door, to the point that the Confederate Congress is tired of hearing all these horror stories, and they launch an investigation. Out of these hospitals up here, guess who had a lower mortality rate? Those run by women, those staffed by women, because mentally, psychologically, to a Southern boy, used to being taken care of by his sister, his mom, his aunt, his grandmother, it looks normal, especially if you've gotten in a hospital. And because of that, the Confederate Congress would enact laws, the Soldier Act, in September of '62, that basically said, you as a surgeon in charge will give her a priority before you hire me. That's how serious they were about it. Now, the types of hospitals, you got to be careful. As Dr. Frommel told me, wait, people will come up to you. My grandmother said down the road, it was a hospital. It was, but what kind of hospital? It varied. For example, your general hospital in the middle, open to any soldier, doesn't care what state, what regiment. They range from 6,000 to 7,000 bed capacity, like up in Virginia. Down here in North Carolina, the largest we have is 500. And there's some various other types of hospitals that I'll go through. But early in the war, when they first started setting up, they went after pre-existing structures. Here in Wilmington, Wilmington's very first general hospital was the old Marine Hospital there. Now, as a writer and researcher, I love diaries, letters, and journals. And unfortunately, there's not a lot written about the medical aspect here in North Carolina, especially hospitals. That's what drove me to do this, because I was motivated after writing about the battles of Bentonville and Averysboro and Wise Fork. What happened to all the wounded? And I went to both motherships libraries that I consider, the Archives in Raleigh and the Library of Congress. There's not a book out there on North Carolina Civil War hospitals. I don't care if you're talking blue or gray, because we have a number of Union hospitals that I'll start to tackle first. But when you go after these things, you're always looking for a primary source, and that's Peter E. Hines. And he wrote a very short 22-page piece right up here, and those of you who ever researched the North Carolina Union Clarks. But a lot of people don't read the last paragraph. He's telling them, be careful now. You're reading it in 2025. I want you to know that I wrote this thing 36 years after the war with nothing in front of me, but based upon memory alone. That's potential. He's a great jump-off point, but you better find something else to back him up. And based upon that, that's why for so many years, all these locations in yellow, he doesn't even mention them in the short story. And they never have. And that's why a lot of these in yellow are covered in volume 1. The problem is he only served in North Carolina essentially the last half of the war. So everything early war, he's up in Virginia when all this is going. So no matter, it's easy to see why it's missing. But anyway, great story needed to be told. Now, volume 2, he's back home. The medical director of North Carolina Hospitals reports to the Surgeon General in Richmond. That's his boss. All right. But the very first one we had down here in North Carolina was Napoleon Cody. He's got one big strike against him, especially with Governor Zebulon Vance. He's not from North Carolina. He gets into it with General Whiting over here in Wilmington, General Martin up in Tarboro. Governor Vance is begging Jeff Davis, President Jeff Davis, get this Marylander out of my state. And it comes to the point that ultimately, after only being in the job 6 months, he tells the Surgeon General, hey boss, just send me wherever. I don't care, get me out of North Carolina. And we bring home a local boy from Raleigh, Peter E. Hines. So he's in charge of all North Carolina's government-run hospitals for the last year and a half of the war. This is what he inherits. Essentially along the I-95 corridor, the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad. Here's Wilmington, a major hospital center that survived Burnside's invasion of here in '62. See, this was all full of, if you go to volume 1, this is all nothing but Confederate hospitals. There's nothing out here. Burnside shows up, Wilmington survives, but everything starts to expand out into the Piedmont along the railroad. Now, there's a major thing that happens with the Surgeon General there, Preston Moore. In March of 1864, he issues this circular. What he tells us, all the medical directors in the North Carolina, throughout the Confederacy, essentially here in North Carolina, Hines, what he tried to do and failed with Congress was to establish what he called a reserve surgical corps. I think of Gettysburg, think of Sharpsburg, Antietam, Shiloh, thousands of wounded. You want to be able to put a team of doctors and hospital stewards in there that go in and back up those surgeons down in the ranks. Why? If the commanding generals want to continue the offense and chase the enemy, those doctors need to go to those regiments and divisions and corps. Have a team of doctors from the rear fall in to make sure they all get evacuated. Well, Congress wouldn't appropriate the money for it, so he basically tells all the medical directors in the state, be prepared to pull out some of your most skillful surgeons to do this. And lo and behold, a month later, boom, the Battle of Plymouth, Brigadier General Robert Hoke at the time, and of course Commander Cook from Beaufort, who commands the Albemarle. The Battle of Plymouth, ultimately a Confederate victory, but there's almost 500 Confederate wounded now stuck in Plymouth, North Carolina, that need to get evacuated. And what Hines will do is he will activate that reserve surgical corps. So it's really the first time in the Confederacy that the concept of the reserve surgical corps is activated right here in North Carolina, because it is a challenge. Because here's Plymouth, here's where all the wounded need to go, to Raleigh, and it's going to be a combination of both up the Roanoke River on steamboats or overland to the railroad to eventually get to Raleigh. And it's a very successful operation for Hines, but actually it's a great warm-up for what's getting ready to happen in '65 here in Wilmington, and a guy by the name of William Tecumseh Sherman coming up out of South Carolina. No sooner had Hines and the rest of them high-fived in Raleigh, yeah, we pulled it off. Guess what happens up in Virginia? The Overland Campaign. Thousands of wounded. Now the Federals are losing a lot more soldiers than Confederates. It doesn't matter. The number of Confederate wounded are overwhelming the hospitals in Richmond and Petersburg. What do? They take, all right, you know what? About another month or so, you'll be okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to put you on a train and send you down to Raleigh, send you down to Wilmington, send you down to Charlotte. That way we can free up bed space for all the wounded up in Virginia. What does that do? It overwhelms the North Carolina system, and all these little locations in red, you see the need that Hines had to establish new hospitals in the Piedmont. Here's some examples here. Wake Forest College, that's the original Wake Forest, not the one in Winston-Salem where it used to be in Wake Forest. Kitchell Springs over in Greensboro. Ladies, they still like to pick on the female schools for some reason. The other thing that Napoleon Covey started was the pavilion-style hospitals. They were still under construction before he got run out of state. But Peter E. Hines will push these things into operation. They're about 500 bed capacity, but they're a pavilion-style hospital that Florence Nightingale, in her notes on the hospital, recommended. This is the U.S. Army's pavilion-style hospital over in Newburgh. Every soldier essentially gets a window, ventilated roof, off the ground, flow of air. She's not figured out disease yet. That doesn't come till after the Civil War. But she's figured out cleanliness, and there's something about airflow that soldiers would heal a whole lot better. They tried to build one here in Wilmington. Napoleon Covey initiated it right there where the Marine Hospital was, where the current day YMCA is here in today. That's where the Marine Hospital was located at. But it sat on about 30, 40 acres, so there was enough room to build one of these pavilion-style buildings. They're 40 by 120, a dozen or so of those. You get the idea. So you needed a little bit of real estate. The problem is there was too much competition for lumber down here in Wilmington because of the shipyards, and they couldn't pull it off. So Wilmington didn't get one. Here in Wilmington, you have the General Marine Hospital. That's the one I just talked about, number 5. General Hospital, number 4. About 250 bed capacity. This was established early on in '61, and shortly thereafter, here comes the General Hospital number 4, operated throughout the war. The other hospital was a Wayside. The Wayside Hospital was a concept developed by the ladies in South Carolina. It's purely a Confederate idea. The Confederate Congress liked it so much that they mandated that the Surgeon General establish them all throughout the Confederacy. But you notice it's right by a railhead. They're primarily for transit soldiers. Let's say you're up in Richmond fighting on the Overland Campaign. You're told to go home to Georgia for 40 days and then come back to the fight. Well, while you're en route or waiting on your connecting flight down here to get across, go to the next railroad that goes to Florence, South Carolina, where are you going to stay? Who's going to feed you? It's in the middle of the winter. You know, so these ladies, you didn't have to be sick or some kind of wound. They still took care of you at the Wayside Hospital. It's almost like a modern day USO if you think about it. But they also did take care of wounded as well. It's, like I said, a very popular concept through the Confederacy. This is the second version of the one here in Wilmington. Wilmington was one of the very earliest ones established. It was privately operated by the ladies here, but then you had the yellow fever in the summer of '62, and it shut it down, and the Confederate Army reestablished it later. So that's the 4 hospitals that we have. Right here is the Division Hospital for Robert Hope's division. There's one that I can't locate, folks, here. It's called, officially titled, the C.S. Negro Hospital. These were for the individuals, free blacks that were impressed by the government, or enslaved individuals based upon your census records. You were told to give up X amount of your slaves for X amount of number of days. And these are the folks building these defenses here, Fort Fisher, Fort Anderson, all throughout eastern North Carolina. You find them. But because of the ugly part of history is here, there's somebody else's property. If you don't take care of them, that owner's going to come back and sue the government if something happens. So that's why they established the Negro Hospital there solely for them here. You have one here in Wilmington and one in Goldsboro. Kick things off towards the end of '64. December of '64, the first battle of Fort Fisher. This is where Hines is really going to get his first taste of how I'm going to take care of the wounded. Fort Fisher down here on the southern end of the point. Craig's Landing up here to the north. Essentially, that is where if anyone was sick or wounded, would have been evacuated over here to modern-day Southport, which was called then Smithfield, to one of the Confederate hospitals that was over here in Smithfield at the time. The other thing that Hines is going to do, just like they did in Richmond and Petersburg, Because we know we got a battle going on at Fort Fisher, what does he start to do? He starts to empty out the hospitals here in Wilmington. And they're going to go up the railroad to either Goldsboro or Wilson, or via steamboat up to the General Hospital here in Fayetteville. So he's making room for potentially a lot of wounded, but that didn't happen, obviously, with the first battle of Fort Fisher. Some of those wounded from some of the sick and such from Wilmington would make it all the way up here to the Goldsboro Hospital. This is Kate Sperry. She's a refugee living at her aunt's house in Goldsboro. She's actually from Winchester, Virginia. If you know your Civil War history, Winchester's blue one day and gray the next. Her daddy sends her down to stay with her aunt, just to say, but she volunteers over here as a nurse here in the Goldsboro Hospital. And then here we have him. Making his movement up north from Savannah. In conjunction with his move north from Savannah into the Carolinas, Grant all of a sudden gets really interested in Fort Fisher, and now we have our second battle of Fort Fisher. On January 15th, I tracked wounded getting out of Fort Fisher. But when the Federals execute that amphibious landing north of the fort, they lose Craig's Landing. Now you have no way really to get them off. Because you have to literally run all the way down to the battery, your exposed naval gunfire. So the wounded from 15 will make it to Southport. There's about 40 some of them that are over there from January 15th. January 16th, none of those boys will escape. I mean, they fall into Union hands. Based upon my research, they're going to wind up, depending on how bad they are, because the Federals don't have Wilmington yet, some of them will wind up at Morehead City. Put-door run up the coast into the fort of Beaufort and Morehead City. There's a hospital there. Some of them will go to the New York Harbor, Parks Island in New York Harbor. But what's interesting, and we're going to track these two right here, there's about a dozen Confederate surgeons that are captured on January 16th. Those faces will reappear here shortly. I won't let the cat out the bag. Here's William Cushing. Immediately once Fort Fisher fell, Commando Cushing, he takes over Smithfield, and he runs, here it is. He locates the Confederate hospital there, where all the wounded that could not be moved, triage-wise, they had to stay. And Surgeon James O. Harris, which was stationed over at Fort Caswell, and since Fort Caswell has now been blown up, he's now left behind as kind of a rear guard to take care of these Confederate soldiers when Cushing captured them. At Fort Anderson, with the fall of South Fort, and as the Federals began that move on both sides of the river to take Wilmington, first of all, you got to get rid of Fort Anderson, right? Well, Fort Anderson's pretty neat. It is a two-story structure, 40 by 24, about a 32-bed capacity. There's a number of wounded that are in there, but on the morning of, right after the battle, Haygood ordered the evacuation of all those soldiers via ambulance up to the hospitals at Wilmington. Now, February 22nd, of course, the Confederates give up Wilmington, and with that, you lose the hospitals here, of course. But the U.S. Army will come in here and take over and begin to use these former Confederate hospitals. And as you track the occupation of the Federal forces, Wilmington, by month, 2 months after the war, there's well over a dozen U.S. Army hospitals here within the Wilmington garrison area. Shortly after Wilmington, we roll into what I call 2 weeks of fury. 4 major battles here in the Old North State, all in a 14-day period. Why is this fort? Monroe's Crossroads, which is your cavalry battle over modern-day Fort Bragg, Averysboro, and Bentonville. Keep in mind, of all 4 of these battles, they're all three of them are offensive in nature by the Confederates. As one of Sherman's veterans would say, the rebels haven't shown this much pluck since Atlanta. But what you're getting out of this whole thing, folks, is a lot of wounded. A lot of wounded, and oh, by the way, you've lost several hospitals. But this is when we're introduced to what's called a field hospital. Temporary in nature. We're lucky here at these locations, these homes still stand. Those who've been to Bentonville, there's the Harper House. Those that have been to Aversboro, all three of these wonderful homes still stand today. This one's semi-open to the public. This one's still in the family, it's closed. But here over here at Battle Wise Fort, it's a Cobb House. So field hospitals were typically established in permanent structures, or in Robert Hope's division, I've learned. They didn't like it. They used tents, hospital tents. They like to roll up the sides. It kind of gets back to that airflow. They're something, yeah, they're on to something. They haven't figured it out yet, but it's got something to do with it. And here we have Case Ferry after the battles. Of course, these hospitals are overwhelmed. And of course, they're eventually going to start to move. She keeps a wonderful diary. As a researcher, it's a golden nugget, but she's writing every day. And she talks about walking into this building on the morning of March 11th, and her old man, who happens to be the hospital, she married the hospital steward, says, "We're packing up and moving." And her diary picks up 8 days later in High Point, North Carolina. So we're able to, based upon her diary of a staff member, just watch the flow of these buildings here. At the Battle of Aversboro, you're always looking for that human interest story. And this is young 17-year-old Jane Smith. Her house, the Lebanon House, was the Confederate Field Hospital. Here she is writing to her niece about a week after the battle, how she talks about how the ambulances just drove up, all the surgeries that's going on outside of her yard. Great story, about 2.5 pages long. Those of you who have my Aversboro book, I've got her entire letter in the appendix of that book. But it's a great human interest story. And then, of course, at Bentonville, here's Miss Amy Harper. This is taken in 1895, so this is 30 years after the battle. But you can just, the Federals, the U.S. Army 14th Corps used their home as a field hospital. There was wounded prisoners, captured wounded Confederates that were brought there. And then after the battle, it became the collection point for a lot of the Confederate wounded that were just left on the battlefield. The Federals have moved on. They buried their dead. They moved on to Goldsboro. But Amy Harper and the ladies in the Bentonville area will take care of almost 100 wounded, not just here, but up in the village of Bentonville itself that was left behind until a team from Raleigh will come down. But because of triage, she's stuck to like 40 some of them. They just can't be moved. They're going to die. And if you go to the Bentonville battlefield in the family cemetery, there's roughly over 20 some graves there of unmarked graves from Confederate soldiers that died under the care of Miss Amy Harper. Remember all those numbers on the map? There's Wilmington, gone. Here's Sherman, Goldsboro, Fayetteville. All that's left here, essentially west of Raleigh. And even in the dying moments of the Confederacy, Peter E. Hines, the medical director, is reestablishing hospitals over in Thomasville, North Carolina, and Statesville to try to take the load and the burden off these hospitals right here. Everything above the red line was before Sherman shows up, before the fall of Fort Fisher. Everything below that line is 2 weeks of fury. So you can see just how so many wounded was coming into Raleigh, not just wounded, but sick as well, where they take over just about every church. And look who's here in charge of all the Raleigh's church hospitals. He was captured at Fort Fisher on January 16th. There was a gentleman's agreement, a one-for-one exchange, that he's not going to sit and waste away in a Union U.S. Army prisoner camp for Confederate soldiers. As soon as they capture a Union surgeon, they're going to do a one-for-one because they realize you need to get him back out there, because we see it at Bentonville, you see it at Aversboro, you see it wise for it. A Confederate surgeon is eventually going to take care of a wounded U.S. Army soldier, triage-wise. He's going to take care of the grave first. And just the opposite, you see it at the Harper House with the U.S. Army taking care of Confederate POWs. So there was a gentleman's agreement to get these surgeons back out into the fight as quickly as possible. And here it is in mid-March, and boom, he's already back here in North Carolina in charge of all the hospitals here in Raleigh, church hospitals. She's moved over to High Point by this time. We talk about how some of these ladies will have a personal connection with some of her patients. And this young special pet, as she calls it, upstairs in the hospital here, was a young lieutenant from Florida who was gunshot wound blinded at Bentonville. And he's telling her as she talks to him and writes a letter home to his wife that, your voice reminds me so much of home and my own wife back home in Florida. So they developed this special bond between those patients. Look out here in Greenville, who's that? Joseph Shepard, January 16th, Fort Fisher. He's in charge of the Presbyterian Church Hospital in Greensboro. So essentially, folks, bottom line, the Piedmont is being overwhelmed. It's just thousands of wounded and sick coming. But there's a deadly side to these women and men who work in these hospitals. And here's a perfect example, Jane Smith, who's another refugee. She was trying to get to Charleston to get married, and there's a guy by the name of Sherman that was cutting a path through South Carolina on the way to North Carolina. So her and her father hang out in High Point, and she volunteers over at the High Point Hospital with Kate Sperry, but eventually she goes to what's called the pest house. You have like an outbreak of chicken pox or some kind of communicable disease. Those people yellow fever. You want to put them outside, away from the general population. It's kind of quarantine hospital, but they're nicknamed pest houses. She volunteers there, and unfortunately, she dies 3 weeks later. She contracts something there, and this was her grave in High Point in the Confederate section, but that's now been taken down and moved. But it is a deadly side to working in a hospital. And with Sherman's capture of Raleigh on April 13th, now look, everything is now in the far west of Piedmont. When we look at the last 2 years of the war, you really see, and one thing I forgot, I'm sorry, I talk off the top of my head, is that railroad right there. Throughout the war, the only rail connection to Virginia was up to Wilmington and Wilmington. And in spring of '64, the Piedmont Railroad opened up between Greensboro and Danville. Straight north from Dansville is Lynchburg, Virginia, and all those tobacco warehouses, a major hospital center in Virginia. So when the overland campaign kicked off that I talked about, the wounded coming down from Petersburg and Richmond via this direction, and you also have it coming down now into the Greensboro High Point area, very important. And what you see is the growing emphasis and the requirement of the railroad really sets it. That's how they moved sick and wounded. You had to get to the closest railroad point to get your soldiers back to the general hospital. And as I sum this up, to have so many things against you, Peter E. Hines does a pretty darn good job. Perfect example, even in the dying moments, he's still thinking and taking care of his wounded and sick soldiers, looking to reestablish whatever the Confederacy loses. Because honestly, this is what's left of the Confederacy after Appomattox right here, at least here in the East. And I think most of y'all have ever seen that. Open it up to questions and answers.
Wade, when the Confederate government collapsed, who picked up? Did anybody? How did they feed whatever the wounded? Did they get fed? Was there any there to care for them? I mean, the hospital staff that's unemployed, or What happened?
Usually what happened, at least here in North Carolina, when Johnston and Sherman surrendered, most of these Confederate hospitals that you see, the U.S. Army, the occupying forces from the 23rd Corps, would move in and take over those hospitals. They didn't throw, now, maybe not here in Wilmington, they literally moved the Confederate from General Hospital number 4 and 5 and consolidated them into a separate building. I don't read about that in Charlotte and Raleigh and such. The U.S. Army surgeons just fell upon those Confederate hospitals, and if you were wounded in there, the war's over. Every soldier that was a patient in those hospitals was paroled. They literally, each hospital filled out the number of patients and the staff. And so they were essentially, they're paroled. They were taken care of by the U.S. Army. In some cases, the U.S. Army authorized some of these surgeons in charge to stay on. If you look at, for example, Surgeon Holt, who worked most of the war in Goldsboro, he's all the way out in Charlotte through almost August before he's let go. He said, you can go home now. Eberk Haywood in Raleigh, he was given a pass by the U.S. Army, the Provost Marshal, to just come and go from the hospital. That way, U.S. soldiers wouldn't bother him, just let him do his business as a surgeon as he goes back and forth every day. So some of these staff members hung on, and there's no pay. They're not getting paid. They're just doing it for, it's the right thing to do. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I was just wondering who provided the rations.
Oh, U.S. Army would. Yeah, U.S. Army. I'm sorry.
What was the mortality rate for wounded in the Civil War?
I don't delve into mortality rate, but like I mentioned to you, the mortality rate is much lower in those hospitals that are operated by women. But I will tell you this, far more men died of disease and non-battle injury than gunshot. Okay. Because there's been no book done on these hospitals before, I mainly focused initially on my research on when were they established, where were they established, and why were they established. And unfortunately, for a lot of the hospitals in the early part of the war, because the Confederate Surgeon General doesn't have a grip on things, there's no weekly reports. So you don't know what the mortality rate is. You know what I'm saying? But come April of '63 on, there's a weekly hospital report from every hospital. If it's Confederate Army, that gives you mortality rate, who died and what they died of. If you really wanted to go down that rabbit hole and research it, you could do that level of research on North Carolina hospitals. But just understand, from May of '61 to May of '62, it's going to be very difficult because you didn't have a Surgeon General thumb down. Where's your report? Where's your report?
Back in the overlay campaign timeframe, you mentioned two things happened. One, Hines stood up a number of additional hospitals, but he also activated the reserve corps. How did he manage to staff those surgeons if he had already, activated them to the front?
Actually, the Surgeon General sent down a team. There's about a half a dozen surgeons that are reassigned from Virginia down to these North Carolina hospitals. Then I'm looking at. Yes.
Was the Confederate government just printing money to pay for this stuff?
To pay for this stuff?
Yeah, to pay for these hospitals?
I will tell you, especially in volume 2, the Southern economy it's not collapsed, it's on its way to collapsing. Prices of everything is skyrocketing. You actually see where the surgeons in charge were literally, because the Confederate Army commissary could not feed the patients in the hospitals. Okay. Literally, you had the surgeons going and sending out teams of, convalescing soldiers to go out and hit the black market and purchase vegetables and stuff. But then you had the women. If a woman did not work in the hospital, she may have been part of a benevolent society. Every Wilmington, Charlotte, Raleigh all had benevolent societies. They're raising and collecting stuff to donate to these hospitals. Okay. A perfect example right here is Mary Bowie here in Wilmington. She's from Augusta, but she is notorious for blockade running Catholics. They see her coming down the wharf, they know she's walking right for them Where's my 50 pounds of coffee? Where's my oranges? I just know you came from you. I need to put it to the boys in the hospital. So we're lucky here, in that sense, here in eastern North Carolina, that because of blockade running, they're able to get some stuff. But there is a tremendous black market going on. The other thing they do here in Wilmington, to the benefit of all the other hospitals, and this goes back to Napoleon Cody, he established what's called a fishery down here. He took convalescing soldiers from the Wilmington Hospital and from any other hospitals in North Carolina. If they come from Carter County or wherever, if they have a fishing background, and they established a fishery here in Wilmington, they salt the fish, put it in barrels, and send it up the railroad to the hospital, and then those hospitals in turn would pay them with some of their Confederate money in return. So you had a lot of this out of the box thinking to overcome some of these shortages and stuff. Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a roster anywhere of the people who came through the hospitals?
There are some surviving the registries. We're lucky here. Wilmington's does. Wilmington is throughout the war. Their patient registry. You have Goldsboro's, Charlotte's, and one from Wyler. Only one of the patient registries. Other than that, they're in the other lands.
Where are those?
Most of them in our National Archives is where you'll find them. Now, I know over here, I think Becky Sawyer from Fort Fisher told me that the UNCW Library for New Hanover County Public Library has it on microfilm. Yeah, if you're looking for a certain individual, yeah, it's kind of, it's rough gigs. It's interesting story. During COVID, I got a phone call. There was a soldier from the 9th New Jersey who occupied Goldsboro right after the Battle of Bentonville, and for some reason, he took home the patient registries. And I'm like, hey, the Goldsboro ones are in it, so which one did he take home? He took home Tarborough's for some reason.
That was before Hitler.
And eventually it made it back to the state archives. And through the connections there, I got a phone call one day, said, well, you might want to see this. I'm going to tell you, it was gold. Because actually, it's more than just a little bit of Tarboro as well as a little bit of Weldon as well in there. So, but it's hit or miss. It goes back to your question. You can try, but yeah, it's hard to track that. They just don't have the records or anything.
What happened to the hospital in Portsmouth Island?
The Portsmouth Island Hospital becomes a U.S. Army hospital. When the U.S. Army takes it over, after Burnside, it becomes a U.S. Army General Hospital throughout the remainder of the building. No, it's gone. All that's left is the old cistern well. It's all gone. Yes, sir.
So up north, the Union nationalized the railroads and put the Army in charge of scheduling. That didn't happen until way late in the war down to the south.
Way late in the war.
What kind of problems did he have scheduling?
I'll tell you, you know what? I'll give you a perfect example. The Battle of Wise's Ford, fought the morning of March 8th. The Confederates captured 900 U.S. Army soldiers. 900, entire brigade. Some of those guys are wounded. Do you believe, I tell you this, hope you believe. March 9th, their names are on the patient registry all the way out in High Point. Now, you got to look at the state of North Carolina map. Here's Kinston all the way over in the east. And High Point's where, you try driving that today, okay? How long does that take? In less than 24 hours, they were there. So all the horror stories you hear about the railroad, here's a perfect example. In less than a day, there's wounded soldiers from Kinston, North Carolina, whose names are now written in a patient registry. But it's not all rosy. Please, I'm not making it rosy. It's very controlled because even General Bragg gets in trouble with General Lee because he held on to the railroad cars in Goldsboro because Lee wanted them cars being sent north with rations out of warehouses in Goldsboro. So, yeah, they don't have it like the U.S. military railroad. They don't have the hawks and stuff like that.
You mentioned the hospital stewards. They were sort of the unknown or unsung heroes of the medical department for both sides during the war. You find a lot of material available in your research on?
Yeah, the one here in Wilmington, hospital steward Patterson. You got to be kind of careful, because he's writing some of the stuff in hindsight, he's kind of like a hero. But no, it's good, it's good. There's other ones that are out there. A hospital steward, just think of a hospital steward as your pharmacist. The surgeon says, this soldier needs this. And now, depending on the size of the hospital, you could have several hospital stewards. One hospital steward, all he does is take care of hospital property, beds and bunks and tables and chairs and linen. Another one might be just responsible for rations, just trying to collect the food because it's such a shortage of it to do that. Matter of fact, it's the hospital steward, Patterson, who's put in charge of the fisheries over here in Wilmington. Why? Because that falls under his realm of getting food to the hospital, fishery does. So they do provide a good service there, but it's more than just drugs.
Wade, as deeply invested as you've become in these topics, is your work complete on North Carolina's hospitals, or are you going on to?
No, I need to show my love to the U.S. Army hospitals.
Okay.
I mean, because you don't get them in this area until after the fall, 65. But in my neck of the woods in Beaufort, we've had them since April of 62. Same way with Elizabeth City, Roanoke Island, Mission, Portsmouth. So they're there early in the war. So that story needs to be done. And the volume 3, I'll finish up the Confederate volume 3 because I didn't want to bog down the chronological story as the fighting goes here in the Carolinas with the fisheries, with General Hospital number 9 out of Salisbury, which is a humanitarian disaster. You go from 98 sick soldiers in the hospital, now you've got over 3,200 sick soldiers in the hospital on the disaster. And that's 2 chapters of one describing the story. So yeah, there's work to be told. But I'm taking a break. I'm back into the military base in Sherman in South Carolina. Other questions? Well, folks, oh yeah.
I just had a question about James Smith's marker. You said it had been removed. Was that part of what happened in the past few years, or was it just degradation over the 90 years, or
Part of that.
the whole thing's gone, or just the flag?
Well, that was a great, weren't it?
Good question. It's in the cemetery. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I didn't know until I spoke a couple of weeks someplace. They said, yeah, that's gone. I showed the slide. They're like, the slide's outdated. I'm like, what? Yeah. Yes.
Did slaves work in Confederate hospitals?
That's a great question. Did slaves work in Confederate hospitals? Absolutely. Because as the war dragged on, Robert E. Lee is beating the heck up out of the Surgeon General. Like, why are you two working in a hospital? You're healthy. You need to be carrying a rifle. Get in the field. So there was constantly officers coming down and inspecting these hospitals and seeing how many soldiers were being employed in these hospitals. Why? Because if you're healthy enough, you can carry a rifle, you belong in the Army of Northern Virginia or the Army of Tennessee. So how do you fill this gap? Because they don't have an endless supply of manpower in the South. You start, as the war drags on, we see more and more of either free blacks that answer ads in the hospital, come be a laundress, cook or nurse, or slave owners. A lot of the eastern plantations, when Burnside shows up in 62, a lot of those owners move their enslaved into the Piedmont region. There's a lot of money to be made on the railroad for men. And there's a lot of money to be made for your female enslaved as cooks, laundresses, and nurses. And as the war drags on, if you look, unfortunately, they don't write. And it's a forgotten piece of the story, but they are very important. When you look at some of these hospital personnel rosters that are monthly reports, black outnumbers white. They're very important.
Well, Richard Patterson here in Wilmington, he was a soldier earlier in the war, and he left front, come here, and was his role, was he managing the hospital? Was he just a reward?
Think of the hospital steward as kind of like the manager, superintendent, because the surgeon in charge, I mean, trust me, he's got a 2-inch thick of reports he's got to do daily, weekly, monthly for the Surgeon General. So he's really taking care of that. And depending upon his other duties, how big the hospital is, Patterson may be responsible for food, I'm responsible for the furniture, and another is responsible for the drugs. Because you can't do everything. A lot of administrative duties as a hospital steward. Folks.
Thank you so much.
Try to make it exciting, you know.
You did an amazing job, Wade. On the behalf of us, please accept this token of our appreciation
Oh, thank you.
to recognize those guns.
Yes, thank you.
Dr. Court.
Thanks for having me, folks.
This will be for the custom shirt.